Kicking off lecture 11, this will be 4 parts to the lecture. Yeah, the last couple of lectures, we were looking at the two paths which in the 19th century opened to the art student. And these were the culmination of those two main traditions, Baroque mode of expression, classical mode of expression, that we had been studying all semester long. But during the second half of the 19th century, a third alternative presented itself to the art world and young art students, and that is modernism. We saw the roots of modernism beginning with realism. What we're doing now is going into the 20th century, breaking that 1900 time barrier, and looking further at the developments of the avant-garde, these revolutionary movements that redefine what art production is all about. Remember, our class is subtitled From Giants to Giant Killers. Well, the giants were the Renaissance giants, Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, Titian. But now we're looking at the giant killers, and we're seeing Jackson Pollock there at the base of that giant liquor bottle. The first 20th century movement that we're looking at is a groundbreaking movement, Cubism, starting right around 1910. And it's Cubism that really breaks away from the pack. Up to that time, around 1910, Cubism is the greatest break with tradition. And it really is a definitive separation to the rules and expectation of image making that had dominated up till that time, the time of Cubism. Look, there are two founders that invented together Cubism, George Braque and Picasso. Here we're looking at a much later painting, 1992, it's by Mark Tansey. He does these historical, art critical images to help explain transitional issues in art history. And here we have Braque and Picasso portrayed as the Wright brothers. And the Wright flyer, that plane that the Wright brothers invented, that now is a contraption of Cubism. So here, Tansey is showing you that with Cubism and Braque and Picasso, modernism really got off the ground. This is a real launcher into 20th century modernism, beginning with Cubism. And Cubism has two phases. The first is analytic, and the second is synthetic. Look, they're alphabetized for you. Analytic is first, synthetic is next. We will first look at the earlier of the two phases. Picasso painted that work we were looking at briefly. He was only like 14 or 15 years old. He was an artistic genius. He mastered traditional technique very early in his development, but he continuously experimented with style. And by the time he was in his late 20s, he was painting like this. And here we have an example of analytic cubism on the right. And the way things would work between Braque and Picasso, the two inventors of Cubism, they would challenge and push each other to take the experiment, Cubism, even further. So, for example, Picasso would paint a work like that, which is a female playing a mandolin, and then he would challenge Braque. Okay, so what can you do with that idea? And Braque would say, okay, here is my conception of a woman playing a musical instrument. Now it's your turn, Picasso. And Picasso would respond by taking the developmental stage of this language even further. Here, too, theoretically, we have a female playing a musical instrument. And then Braque would respond with something like this, in this case, a male playing a musical instrument. And they took this back and forth until they developed almost synonymous styles. It's really difficult to determine who painted what. They were really on the same thought, the same page during this brief development of analytic cubism. What I want us to look at here is the main characteristics of analytic cubism from 1909 to 1912. First of all, you have an elimination of color. The reason why that was important, Braque and Picasso were reinventing the language of pictorial art. That alone was enough to occupy them. They did not want to also have to worry about the issue of color. They really wanted to focus on form, so they drained color from their canvases. Analytic cubism has a near monochromatic palette, a very short range of earth tones and silvers, a very neutral palette. So here, analytic cubism has a near monochromatic palette. Remember that for a quiz. Number two, you also have the development of analytic cubism, these brick-like brush strokes. Up there, you see that? You can come in to a detail and look at how, in this case, Braque has just patted the surface of his canvas with these horizontal strokes. You can go down there and look at other examples. To me, they look a lot like lichen on a tree, or maybe even shimmering fish scales. They have a very organic, natural look and coloration. It's really quite beautiful. Another feature is the composition stack upwards. You see, this is a still life on the left, and the table doesn't really go back into space. It's all tilted towards the picture plane, like everything's going to start sliding off. Compositions stack upwards. Number four. Yeah, this is a little more challenging to look at. I'm going to take away that apparatus, and I want you to try to see the remaining vertical and horizontal implied lines in that composition. They are there. I mean, this is it's not accidental, it's not haphazard, it's such an intellectually constructed composition that there's this apparatus of horizontals and verticals, rather similar to like shingles on a roof. In other words, it forms a grid, a compositional grid, and this is known as the cubist grid. The cubist grid is very famous. It's one of the lasting influences of cubism, even today, in today's art production. And it's a compositional strategy that weaves the elements together in this grid-like pattern. And you see it throughout all the Cubist productions, not just in this one example on the screen. And even if we go into the 1960s and look at Warhol's 100 soup cans, you still see the Cubist grid. Warhol here has adopted that compositional strategy that was introduced, codified by Cubism. Another feature of analytic Cubism, the compositions are arranged in a triangular configuration. Let me impose a triangle right there, and I'm going to take it away. Maybe you can see how these elements, visual elements, are subtly arranged. The density of the composition falls within that triangular configuration, and then you have more of a void, more of less activated space on either side of that triangular slant as we approach the apex at the top. In other words, analytic cubism is very classical, and you can think back about the classical origins of the triangular configuration that we saw in the Roman High Renaissance. Number 6, and this feature is truly groundbreaking. It's the obliteration of the figure-ground relationship. Let's go up there and take a look at that passage. Now here, the objects on the table, the still life objects on the table, are really difficult to distinguish from the void, the space around those objects. The space would be considered the ground, like the background, and the objects would be the figure. Look at this. Here we have a chair in space. We see a sharp separation between the figure and the ground, the object and the surrounding environment, because we live in a three-dimensional world. But what Braque and Picasso are doing, they're reinventing the rules for this two-dimensional world, that is, this two-dimensional surface of a painting. So what they are trying to do is intentionally obliterate that third dimensional distinction between three-dimensional space and an object occupying it. So they are obliterating that clear separation between object and surrounding three-dimensional space because they're creating a new two-dimensional world. All right, so the 6 main elements I'm introducing you to with analytic cubism are these. Let's review. A monochromatic palette, right? They've drained the canvas of color. You have brick-like brushstrokes, and the brick-like brushstrokes, emphatically emphasize the two-dimensional surface of the painting. They're like slapping that paint on, saying, "Look, this is a planar surface. It's not, an actual table that's receding in depth." You also have that stacked composition going up and not back. Another reminder to the viewer that this is a two-dimensional flat surface. A triangular composition, that classical triangular composition. The cubist grid, that very sophisticated and subtle network of horizontals and verticals that tie everything together compositionally. And no distinct figure-ground relationship. Everything merges, blends, slips underneath each other. And the general imagery of analytic cubism, takes on a shard-like appearance. It's like, broken glass. Indeed, it's as though the cubists painted their work on a pane of glass and dropped it, and all the shards sort of slip underneath each other and merge into the various passages. That's that distinctive look of analytic cubism. But it's not confusing because it's all controlled by that grid-like composition and the pyramidal triangular arrangement of the visual elements. If we think back to this guy, Paul Cézanne, look, he was the one of all the post-impressionists that really was far more classical minded. He wanted to, use the language of impressionism. towards the goals of the art in the museums. And one thing he truly favored was that triangular classical composition. And Cezanne was very classical in his approach in composing his works. Another thing we saw with Cezanne, he was the first artist to truly explore that tension between the two-dimensional reality of the paint surface, the canvas, and the three-dimensional illusionism of the scene in pictorial space behind the picture plane. And he played back and forth with that for the viewer. Well, if we go and look at this list of 6 traits of analytic cubism, what did they learn from Cezanne? They learned 4 of them. The stacked composition, which emphasized the two-dimensional surface, like Cezanne, of his canvas. The cubist grid actually also has its origins in Cezanne. Cezanne is the guy that used a brick-like brushstroke, emphatically asserting the planarity of his canvas, and we did look at the fact that he used a triangular composition. Those 4 contributions of Cezanne to the development of analytic cubism earns Cezanne the title Father of Modern Art, because Cubism was that first avant-garde movement that broke away definitively from the past in picture making, and it owes so much of its inspiration to Cezanne, the father of modern art. All right, that ends part 1. We'll do part 2 next time.